If you enjoy mysterious stories full of suspense and thought-provoking revelations, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of the upcoming stories. And also, take this opportunity to tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I always enjoy seeing how far these stories are going and reading each of your messages. The silence of that street was unusual, even by the standards of wealthy neighborhoods in the United States. Elegant mansions lined the streets like monuments to power, but there was one in particular that seemed out of place, as if time itself had decided to ignore it. Surrounded by wrought iron fences and ancient trees that partially blocked the view, the Whitmore family property carried an unsettling presence, something that could not be explained solely by its imposing architecture or excessive luxury. Ethan Cole watched everything from inside his car parked across the street. An investigative journalist known for exposing uncomfortable truths, he had already confronted corrupt politicians and dangerous businessmen. But there was something about that house that made him hesitate. It wasn't fear, at least not the kind he knew, but a persistent feeling that he was about to cross a line from which there was no return. The Whitmore family was practically a local legend. Wealthy, discreet, and influential, they rarely appeared in public. When they did, it was always with impeccable elegance and smiles, too controlled to seem natural. There were no scandals, no records of conflicts, nothing to justify the level of isolation in which they lived. Still, rumors had been circulating for years. Disappearances, employees who simply stopped showing up, deliveries made in the early hours of the morning, always received by someone who was never the same person. And above all, the absolute silence emanating from inside the mansion. Ethan didn't believe in coincidences. That's why he accepted the case when he received an anonymous message days before. A single file containing blurry photos and a short text. "They are not what they seem. Come in and see." Now, standing there, he mentally reviewed every detail he had managed to gather. The property had no visible cameras, which was strange for someone with so much money. There were no recent records of renovations, although the structure always seemed immaculate. And most unsettling, there were no official records of permanent employees in the last 5 years. He carefully opened the car door, the sound seeming too loud on that quiet street. He adjusted his coat and crossed slowly, each step echoing more in his mind than on the asphalt. As he approached the gate, he noticed it was ajar. That didn't make sense. He pushed the gate open gently. The metallic creak cut through the air, and for a moment he had the distinct feeling that someone or something had noticed his presence. The garden was perfectly manicured, but something was wrong. The flowers were too beautiful, as if they would never wilt. Not a single dry leaf on the ground, no sign of human neglect. Everything seemed artificial. The main door of the mansion opened before he could even knock. A woman was standing there, tall, elegant, impeccably dressed, as if she were ready for an event that would never happen. Her eyes were calm, but there was a coldness in them that Ethan recognized immediately. Absolute control. "Mr. Cole," she said with a slight smile, "we were expecting you." That made his stomach churn. "Waiting," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Of course. You don't think someone would set foot here without us knowing, do you?" Before he could react, she turned and went inside, leaving the door open as an invitation or a trap. Ethan hesitated for just a second. Then he went in. The interior of the mansion was even more disturbing than the exterior. Extreme luxury, antique furniture, rare works of art, everything impeccably arranged. But what was most striking was the smell. A light, overly sweet perfume that seemed to conceal something beneath, something metallic. Something is wrong. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," said the woman, walking slowly across the hall. "I imagine you have many questions." "I have a few," Ethan replied, observing every detail, every shadow. "And we have some answers." She paused and looked directly at him, but not all of them are meant to be understood. A faint sound echoed through the house, like a step, or perhaps several. Ethan turned around quickly, but there was no one there. When he looked back at Eleanor, her smile had vanished. "There are rules here," she said, her voice now devoid of any gentleness. "And the first one is simple. Don't go where you haven't been invited." The air seemed heavier. Ethan realized at that moment that this investigation was unlike any other. He wasn't just discovering a secret, he was inside it, and perhaps it was already too late to leave. In the background, a long corridor stretched into the darkness. For a brief second, Ethan thought he saw something moving inside, a silhouette, or perhaps just his mind trying to give shape to the unknown. But one thing was certain, that house was not empty, and the silence was not the absence of sound. It was a matter of restraint, as if something were waiting, observing, and smiling in the dark. Ethan followed Eleanor through the mansion's interior, his gaze fixed on every detail. The polished wooden floors reflected the soft light of the chandeliers, creating an almost hypnotic glow. There was no dust, no imperfections. Everything seemed frozen in a state of impossible perfection. Yet, the more he observed, the more he noticed small inconsistencies. Slightly misaligned paintings, antique clocks showing different times, closed doors that seemed to breathe. "This house has been in the family for generations," Eleanor said, as if reading her thoughts. "Every space carries a part of our history." Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on a portrait hanging on the wall. A family posed in front of their mansion. The clothes suggested the photo was decades old, perhaps more than a century. But what made his heart race was recognizing Eleanor's face. Exactly the same, without any sign of aging. "Interesting, isn't it?" she commented, approaching. "Some traditions are kept very carefully." Before he could ask, footsteps echoed upstairs. This time there was no doubt someone else was there, or several. "Is your family home?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual. "We always are," she replied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. They entered a spacious room, decorated with antique furniture and a lit fireplace, despite the weather not calling for it. On a central table were objects that seemed to belong to different eras. An old pocket watch, a music box, yellowed photographs, and a dark-covered notebook, worn by time. Ethan approached the notebook, but before he could touch it, Eleanor closed the lid tightly. "Certain things are not for visitors." Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it was decisive. "I'm a journalist," Ethan said. "I'm not usually just a visitor." She stared at him for a few seconds, evaluating every word, every gesture. Then she walked to the fireplace, adjusting an object on the shelf. "And that's exactly why you're here," he replied. "Curiosity has always been valued in this house." The sound of something being dragged came from the hallway. This time, closer. Ethan turned quickly, but again there was no one in sight. Only the door was ajar, swaying slightly, as if someone had just passed through. "His employees are discreet," he commented. "We don't use employees," Eleanor replied without hesitation. That reinforced everything he had discovered. "So who's walking around the house?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window and slightly parted the curtain. Outside, the garden remained still, as if the world inside didn't obey the same rhythm as the rest. "Do you believe in legacy, Mr. Cole?" she asked, completely changing the course of the conversation. "It depends on what you're trying to hide with that." A slight smile appeared again. "Legacy isn't about hiding. It's about preserving." Before Ethan could insist, the door to the room slowly opened. A man entered. Tall, with a rigid posture, his gaze too empty to be mere weariness. He wore an impeccable suit, but something was out of place. His expression seemed rehearsed. "This is Arthur," said Eleanor, "a member of the family." Arthur simply nodded without saying a word. Ethan watched intently. Something was profoundly wrong. The way he moved, how his eyes took so long to focus, it wasn't natural. "Nice to meet you," said Ethan, trying to elicit some reaction. Arthur didn't answer. He just kept staring. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. "Arthur doesn't talk much," Eleanor explained. "He prefers to observe." "I can imagine," Ethan replied, feeling a shiver run down his spine. His eyes quickly returned to the notebook on the table. It seemed too important to be just a decorative object. He needed to find out what was inside. "May I ask you a few questions about your family history?" he asked, trying to maintain control of the situation. "You can try," Eleanor replied. Before he could continue, a loud sound echoed through the house, like something falling upstairs. This time, even Eleanor seemed slightly disturbed. "Stay here," she said, heading towards the door. But Ethan was already on the move. "I think I'd better take a look at that." "I told you to stay," she replied, now firmly. But it was too late. Ethan had already left the room and was walking down the dark hallway. Each step felt heavier, as if the very floor resisted his presence. The sound had come from upstairs, and the staircase ahead of him seemed longer than it should be. As the air rose, it became colder, denser. The upstairs hallway was even quieter. Doors lined up, all closed, except one, slightly open. A slight creaking sound came from there. Ethan approached slowly, feeling his heart beat faster with each step. He pushed the door open carefully. The room was empty, or so it seemed, but in the center a chair was rocking by itself. And on the wall, dozens of photographs, all the same, different people, but always in the same position, always inside that house. And in all of them, there was something behind them, a shadow, observing. Ethan approached one of the photos, and then he realized one of the figures was not a shadow. It was Eleanor, looking from behind. Decades ago, exactly the same. An intense chill ran through his body. That wasn't just a family. It was something much older, much more wrong, and he had just entered the heart of it. Ethan stepped back slowly, his eyes still fixed on the photo. His breathing became heavier, not from physical exertion, but from the growing sense that he was facing something that defied all logic. He had investigated cults, covered up crimes, and influential families with dark secrets before, but this surpassed any known standard. The creaking of the wood behind him made him turn sharply. The door, which had previously been only slightly ajar, was now completely open. Eleanor was standing in the hallway, property, observing. "I warned you not to go up," she said, with a calmness that sounded more threatening than any scream. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. He pointed to the wall. "That's not normal. Normalcy is a convenient construct," she replied, stepping forward, "especially for those who need to ignore certain truths." He looked at the photos again. Each one seemed to record not just people, but moments captured too late, as if everyone there had already been marked by something inevitable. "Who are these people?" he asked. "They were invited," Eleanor replied. "Just like you." The tension in the air increased. "And what happened to them?" She didn't answer. But it wasn't necessary. The silence spoke volumes. Ethan took a deep breath and ran a hand over his face, trying to maintain control. This couldn't go beyond the realm of reason. There needed to be an explanation. "Is this some kind of act? A psychological game?" he insisted. "You attract people, manipulate them, create a narrative?" "You're still trying to understand based on the world you know," Eleanor interrupted. "That's your mistake." A dry sound echoed down the hallway. A door slamming shut. Then another one, and another one. Like a chain reaction, Ethan turned quickly, watching the doors close one by one, until only the empty hallway remained, and the silence returned, heavier than before. "What's going on here?" His voice now carried more urgency. "The house is waking up," said Eleanor. That sent a shiver down his spine. "Houses don't wake up. This one wakes up. Before he could react, Arthur appeared at the end of the corridor. This time his gaze wasn't empty. There was something different, something conscious, and he was closer than he should have been. Ethan was certain he hadn't seen him climb up. Arthur began to walk slowly toward her. His steps were firm, but there was a strange delay between the movement and the sound, as if they were not synchronized with the environment. "He doesn't like it when rules are broken," Eleanor said without looking away. "He's family, right?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "He is part of her." Arthur stopped a few meters away. His face remained neutral, but his eyes were now fixed directly on Ethan, as if piercing through him. "What does he want?" Ethan asked. "The same as the house," Eleanor replied. "And what is that?" A silence. Then she said, "Permanence." The ground beneath Ethan's feet seemed to vibrate slightly. It wasn't an ordinary tremor. It was as if something was moving inside the structure of the house. He took a step back, and then he realized something even worse. The staircase he had climbed was no longer in the same place. The hallway seemed longer, much longer. "That's not possible," he murmured. "You're in," Eleanor said. "Now you need to understand the rules for getting out." "So there is a way out?" he asked quickly. She tilted her head slightly. "There always is." Arthur took another step forward. Ethan stepped back again, his heart racing. "And what is the price?" Eleanor finally smiled for real. "Discover." A new sound echoed, this time coming from inside the room. Ethan turned around slowly. The chair that had been rocking had stopped, but now there was something about her, seated, a figure, costs, property. "You weren't alone in there," Eleanor said. Ethan felt his body go cold. The figure began to move, slowly, turning the chair around. The creaking was loud, drawn out and prolonged, until the face became visible. It was him, or something identical to it, but with a smile that was too distorted to be human. Ethan instinctively recoiled. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It's more real than anything you've ever investigated," Eleanor replied. Arthur took another step forward. The other Ethan stood up from his chair, and for the first time he spoke. "You took too long." The voice was the same, but empty, like an echo without origin. The real Ethan felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, not physically, but mentally. His logic, his experience, everything was shattering right there. "What are you?" he asked, now unable to hide his fear. Eleanor took one last step forward, placing herself between him and Arthur. "We are what remains when time ceases to matter." The corridor seemed to close in around them, the nearest walls. The air is heavier. Ethan realized he wasn't just investigating something dangerous, he was being absorbed. And the more I tried to understand, but the house seemed to respond. But not with answers. Yes, with presence, observing, learning, and maybe getting ready. Ethan didn't wait for any more explanations. Instinct took over. He turned abruptly and ran down the hall, away from Eleanor, from Arthur, and from that impossible version of himself. The sound of his own footsteps seemed delayed, echoing, as if the house were mimicking his movements instead of simply reflecting them. Doors along the hallway began to open slowly as he passed. Not all at once, one at a time, as if each room was being deliberately presented to him. In the first one, a child's bedroom. Old toys were scattered across the floor, all intact, as if they had been left there just minutes before. A wooden rocking horse swayed on its own, creaking softly. On the wall, drawings made by a child, a large house, and dark figures around it. Ethan didn't stop. Through the second door, a dining room. A long table, set for dozens of people. Clean plates, neatly aligned cutlery, glasses with a dark liquid that seemed never to evaporate. The chairs were slightly pushed aside, as if someone had just gotten up, or was about to sit down at any moment. A breathing sound came from somewhere inside. He stepped back and continued. The third door revealed something that made him stop. An office. And it wasn't just any office, it was his, or a perfect replica, the same desk, the same disorganized papers, even the same recorder he used in interviews. Everything was there, except for one detail. On the table, there was an open file. With his name on the cover, Ethan Cole. His heart raced even faster. Against any instinct for self-preservation, he went in. Each step felt heavier, as if the environment resisted his presence. He slowly approached the table and looked at the contents of the file. Reports, photos, notes, everything about him, since childhood. There were records of places he never told anyone he'd been. Personal moments, mistakes, decisions, everything documented with frightening precision. "The house learns," said a voice behind him. Ethan turned abruptly. Eleanor was leaning against the door. "Learn from those who enter," she continued. "Absorb, recreate, preserve." "That's not possible," he replied, his voice lower now, almost faltering. "You keep insisting on this." He pointed to the file. "Who did this?" "You." The silence that followed was heavy. "Every choice you made, every place you visited, it all left its mark," she explained. "The house just organizes it." Before he could answer, a metallic noise echoed in the hallway, like something being dragged closer than before. "You're not the first to try to understand," Eleanor said, "and you won't be the last." "What happens to those who stay?" Ethan asked, even though he dreaded the answer. She didn't answer directly. Instead, he walked to the table and calmly closed the file. "They become part of it." A distant scream cut through the air. It wasn't recent. It looked old. Like an echo trapped in the walls. Ethan left the office quickly, feeling that staying there any longer would cause him to miss something he couldn't yet define. The hallway had changed again. Now the walls were covered with even more photographs. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. He approached one. He recognized the face. A journalist disappeared years ago. He remembered the case. It was never solved. In the photo, the man was inside that house, smiling, but his eyes were empty. "They're still here," Eleanor said, appearing silently beside him. "In a way." "Is this some kind of prison?" Ethan asked. "It's more complex than that." Arthur reappeared at the end of the corridor. This time he wasn't alone. Other figures began to emerge from the shadows. People, but not completely. Their movements were slow, as if guided by something invisible. Their faces were familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, like incomplete versions of who they once were. Ethan stepped back. "Are they alive?" "They are present," Eleanor replied. The difference in words brought no comfort. A clock's ticking sound began to echo through the house. Tick, and so on. Tick, and so on. But there was no clock in sight. "Time works differently here," she said. "It doesn't pass. It accumulates." Ethan looked around, trying to find a way out, a pattern, anything that still obeyed the rules of the real world. But there was nothing. Everything there seemed to exist to keep him inside. "Why me?" he finally asked. Eleanor observed him more closely this time. "Because you're looking for it. Many people are looking for it, but not all of them are willing to join." The clock's sound grew louder, faster. The figures began to approach. Arthur took another step, and then another. "You need to decide," Eleanor said. "Resist or understand." "What if I don't want either of them?" She tilted her head slightly. "Then the house decides for you." The ground shook again, this time stronger. One of the walls began to slowly open, revealing a new space, dark, deep. Ethan felt, with an almost instinctive certainty, that this was the center of everything. Where did it all come from? And perhaps, where was it all going? "That's the only path you haven't explored yet," Eleanor said. The figures stopped. Silence returned. Heavy, expectant. Ethan stared into the darkness ahead of him. Then back. There was no way out in sight anymore. The house had closed all options, except for one. And for the first time since entering, he noticed something even more disturbing. That was more than just a place. It was a system, with rules, with purpose, and he was already too deep inside to simply leave. Ethan stood motionless for a few seconds before the dark opening. The air emanating from it was different, colder, denser, as if it carried something beyond temperature. It wasn't just a physical space, it was a presence. Behind him, Eleanor and the other figures remained silent, as if awaiting an inevitable decision. Ethan took a deep breath, and he went in. Darkness enveloped him immediately, but it wasn't total. As he moved forward, small lights appeared on the walls, like fragments of memory being lit. They weren't lamps, they were images, prices, moments. He recognized the first instant. It was his childhood. He, still a child, stood at the door of his house, observing an argument between his parents. The scene was complete. Sounds, expressions, details he hadn't remembered for years, but there they were, intact. "That's not possible," he murmured, touching the wall. The image reacted to the touch. It changed. Now he was seeing a different moment. His first major investigation. The fear before publishing the story, the hesitation, the choice. Each scene that emerged seemed to pull something out of him. Forgotten emotions, buried decisions, regrets never revisited. "You finally arrived," said a voice. Ethan turned around quickly. The figure was there. The same one I had seen in the room, his own version. But now it's clearer, more realistic. "What is this?" Ethan asked, trying to maintain his sanity. "That's you," the figure replied. "Or rather, everything you left behind." "That doesn't make sense. It does more than you imagine." The figure walked slowly around him, observing him like a reflection that had gained autonomy. "Every person who comes in here brings something incomplete with them," she continued. "Fears, unresolved decisions, denied parts of themselves." "And the house," Ethan began. "The house doesn't create anything," the other interrupted. "It reveals." The ground beneath them began to pulse slightly, like a heart. Images on the walls have started moving faster now. Moments that Ethan didn't want to relive. Choices he avoided. People he left behind. "Is this some kind of test?" he asked, his voice even more tense. "No," the figure replied. "It's a process." "Process of what?" The other Ethan stopped in front of him, eyes fixed, a gentle smile. "Replacement." The silence fell like a weight. "What do you mean by that?" "Did you really think those people in the photos were just imprisoned?" the figure said. "No, they're still here, but not as you imagine." Ethan took a step back. "The house needs to be maintained," the other continued. "It needs to evolve, to learn, and for that it needs new elements." Elements, consciences. Ethan's heart raced. "Are you saying that you weren't invited by chance?" The images suddenly stopped. Everything went silent. Then a single scene appeared before them. Ethan recognized him immediately. It was the moment he received the anonymous message, but now he saw something different, a detail that had gone unnoticed. In the reflection of the screen, there was someone behind him, observing Eleanor, long before he arrived at the mansion. "This can't be," he murmured. "You can," the other replied. "You were chosen long before you accepted." "Why?" The figure moved closer, so close that Ethan could see every detail of himself, distorted. "Because you are exactly what the house needs right now." "And what is that?" The smile widened slightly. "Someone who questions." A loud sound echoed around, like something closing up. Ethan looked around. The exit through which he had entered had disappeared. The walls began to slowly close in. "You're not here to discover the truth," the other said. "You're here to become part of it." "I'm not going to stay," Ethan replied, now firmly, even though he felt his fear growing. "You're already staying." The ground shook once more. The images began to disappear, one by one, until only darkness remains, and the sound of footsteps, several, approaching. Ethan turned around quickly. The figures that were in the hallway were now there, within that space, observing, waiting. Arthur was among them, property, but present. "The time has come," said Eleanor, appearing in the doorway that hadn't been there before. "What time is it?" Ethan asked. She looked at him with a different expression now, less control, more truth. "To decide who you're going to be in here." The other Ethan stepped forward. The figures drew closer. The space was closing in. And for the first time, Ethan realized something essential. There was no way to leave the house as the same person who entered, because the house held more than just secrets. She transformed, it replaced, and above all, I chose. Space seemed to collapse around Ethan the instant Eleanor finished speaking. There was no explosion, no physical impact, just an invisible compression, as if reality itself were adjusting to accommodate a new decision that had not yet been made. The figures moved forward, not in a hurry, but with a disturbing certainty. Ethan instinctively recoiled, his eyes searching for any escape route, any flaw in that impossible system. But there were no doors, no windows, nothing to indicate a way out. Only walls that seemed to breathe slowly, as if they were alive. "Stay away," he said, his voice firm but heavy with tension. No one answered. Arthur took another step, then another one. Ethan realized something crucial at that moment. They weren't trying to attack him. They were waiting, as if he needed to do something first. His gaze quickly returned to the other version of himself. "You said this is a process," Ethan said, trying to buy time, "so it's not over yet." The other Ethan tilted his head slightly. "It's closer than you think, so I still have a choice, a silence. Brief, but significant." "There's always a choice," the figure replied, "but it doesn't always mean a way out." The ground beneath Ethan's feet pulsed again, this time stronger, like an irregular heartbeat. Something was changing, or reacting directly to his words. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He thought, not to run away, but in understanding, everything there seemed to revolve around a central idea: absorption, repetition, permanence. The house didn't destroy, it didn't attack, it incorporated. I was learning, and it replaced. He opened his eyes again. "Those who came before," he began, looking at the figures around him. "Did they resist?" Eleanor answered this time. "Everyone resists at first." "And then what?" She did not hesitate. "They understand." Ethan took a deep breath. Or are they forced to understand? The silence that followed was the answer. The other Ethan took another step forward. "You're trying to turn this into a confrontation," he said. "But that's not how it works." "So how does it work?" Ethan retorted. The figure slowly opened its arms. "You are not being defeated. It is being integrated." A sharp sound cut through the room, like a glass cracking. Ethan felt a sharp pressure in his head. Images began to surface again, but this time they weren't just memories. Those were different lives, other perspectives. He saw through the eyes of other people who had gone in there. He felt their fear, their confusion, the exact moment they realized there was no conventional way out. And then, the moment they stopped resisting, Ethan fell to his knees. "No," he murmured, pressing his head down with his hands. "It's starting," said Eleanor, watching intently. "Stop it!" he shouted, but there was no interruption. The images continued, a man running down the hallways until he stopped, a woman trying to break a window until she gives up, a young man pleading for help until he fell silent. They all arrived at the same point: acceptance. The other Ethan crouched down before him. "You are seeing what they saw," he said calmly, "feeling what they felt." "This isn't real," Ethan insisted, but his voice no longer had the same strength. "It's inevitable." The ground stopped pulsating. Silence returned, but something had changed. Ethan slowly raised his gaze. His eyes looked different, not empty, but deeper still, as if they were carrying more than they should. "If I accept," he began with difficulty. "What happens to me?" Eleanor replied. You stay. How do they? As part of it. Ethan remained silent for a few seconds. Then he asked the question that really mattered. What if I don't accept? This time, it was Arthur who answered. Her voice emerged for the first time, low, dragged, but clear. You're still here? A chill ran through Ethan's entire body. Then there is no choice at all, he said. There's a difference, Eleanor corrected, between resisting until you disappear or understanding and moving on. The other Ethan stood up. The house doesn't need your permission to keep you here, he said, but it needs your awareness to evolve. The figures around them took another step. Closer, more gifts. Ethan stood up slowly. The fear was still there, but now mixed with something new. Clarity. He looked around for Eleanor, for Arthur, for the figures, and finally, for yourself. So this was never about leaving, he said. Eleanor nodded slightly. Never. The silence that followed was no longer just tension. It was understanding, partial, dangerous, but enough to change everything. Ethan realized at that moment that fighting against the house wasn't the real challenge. The real challenge was maintaining who he was, while everything around him was trying to change him. And maybe this was precisely the point where all the others failed. Ethan remained standing, breathing more steadily, even with everything around him defying logic. The fear was still there, pulsing beneath his skin, but it no longer controlled his movements. Something was different now. It wasn't acceptance. It was adaptation. He finally understood that reacting as he always had, questioning, confronting, trying to prove that it was impossible, only brought him closer to the fate that the house seemed to impose. So he did the opposite. He remained silent. He observed. The figures around them didn't move this time. They remained motionless, as if awaiting a new response. Eleanor stared at him with heightened attention, while Arthur maintained that fixed gaze, but now less empty, almost curious. "You've changed," said the other Ethan, tilting his head slightly. Ethan did not respond immediately. He took a step forward, not towards the exit, because he knew there wasn't one, but towards the center of that space. "No," he finally said. "I just stopped playing the wrong way." The silence that followed was different. The house seemed to react. The walls, once oppressive, receded slightly. The space expanded a few centimeters, almost imperceptibly, but enough to indicate that something had changed. Ethan realized, and he continued. "You said that the house doesn't create," he said, looking directly at his other version. "That it only reveals." The other Ethan remained silent. "So all of this," Ethan gestured around, "depends on what I bring with me." Eleanor was watching intently now. "Partly," she replied. "No," Ethan corrected. "Absolutely not." He began to walk slowly, passing the figures. This time, none of them tried to block him. Every person who came in here brought fear, doubt, unresolved fragments, he continued. And the house used that. "He didn't use it," said the other Ethan. "He just reflected." Ethan stopped in front of him. "So you're not her creation?" A brief silence. "No," replied the figure. "You are a part of me." The smile on the other Ethan's face faltered for the first time. Small, but it's real. "Finally," he said. The air around seemed to stabilize. The previously non-existent sound, that constant echo, has diminished. Ethan took another step forward. "And if you are a part of me, then I don't need to fight you." The other Ethan stared at him, not even accepting you. Now it was Eleanor's turn to react, narrowing her eyes slightly. "What are you doing?" she asked. Ethan didn't look away, finishing what no one else has finished in here. He closed his eyes for a moment. The images are back. Memories, errors, choices. But this time, he didn't back down. He didn't try to deny it. He just acknowledged it, one by one, without running away, without justification, without getting lost in them. The environment reacted immediately. The figures around them began to fade, like reflections in turbulent water. Some disappeared completely, others remained, but distorted. Arthur took a step back, for the first time. "This isn't resistance," Eleanor said, her tone now different. "This is consciousness," Ethan finished, opening his eyes. The other Ethan remained standing, without making any progress, without backing down. "If you are a part of me," Ethan said, "then you don't need to replace me." Silence. "Because you were never separated." The smile had completely disappeared from the figure's face, and slowly she began to change, not physically, but in person, less dense, less dominant. "You're breaking the pattern," Eleanor said. "No," Ethan replied. "I understand him." The ground stopped pulsating. The walls stopped moving. The atmosphere, for the first time since he entered the house, seemed stable, but not empty, controlled. Ethan took a deep breath. "The house doesn't hold you back," he said. "People get lost inside what they bring with them." Eleanor remained silent. Arthur didn't move. The remaining figures watched. "And when they get lost," Ethan continued, "the house takes over." The other Ethan was now just a few steps away from him, but it no longer seemed like a threat. "So, what are you going to do?" the figure asked. Ethan replied without hesitation, "Not to get lost." An absolute silence filled the space. And then something happened. The walls slowly opened up, not like before. This time no pressure, without imposition. As an answer, a path began to form, unlike all the others. That's clearer, more clearly defined. Eleanor watched that attentively, without interfering. "Interesting," he murmured. Arthur tilted his head slightly, and the remaining figures disappeared. Ethan looked down the path ahead, then to Eleanor. "That's not a way out, is it?" he asked. She answered honestly for the first time, "Not as you imagine." He nodded. "That's enough." And he began to walk, not to run away, but to continue. And for the first time since he entered that house, he wasn't reacting to what she was doing. The house was reacting to him. Ethan stepped forward along the new path without hesitation. The difference was clear. There was no longer that invisible pressure trying to guide him, nor any abrupt changes around him. The space now responded in a more subtle way, almost respecting each step he took. The corridor was long, but it didn't seem distorted as before. The walls, once vibrant and unstable, were now firm. There were still marks, shadows, slight undulations like ingrained memories, but nothing moved without reason. Behind him, silence remained. Eleanor did not follow him. Arthur didn't show up. And that, in itself, was already a sign. Ethan understood that this stage wasn't about direct confrontation. It was about being prepared for what was to come. As he walked, he noticed something different on the walls. They were no longer random images. Now they were more organized fragments, sequences, stories. He stopped in front of one of them. A man enters the house confident, exploring, resisting, questioning, then getting lost. But there was a new detail. At the end of the sequence, instead of disappearing completely, the man seemed divided. Part of him remained, but another part dissolved, being absorbed. Ethan went ahead. Another sequence. A woman, determined, more durable than the others, but at the decisive moment, he hesitated. And it was at that moment that the house took over. Ethan closed his eyes for a second. That wasn't just a record, it was a learning experience. The company didn't repeat mistakes. She was adjusting. "So you evolve," he murmured. The runner responded. A slight vibration ran through the room, as if it had been understood. Further on, the path began to narrow. The air grew heavier again, but not like before. Now there was a different kind of tension, targeted. As a point of convergence, Ethan continued. His steps were firm, but his mind was on high alert. He knew that all of this was leading up to a single moment, the point where the house would stop observing and he would begin to act. At the end of the corridor, he found a door. unlike all the others, without ornamentation, no doorknob, just a smooth, dark, almost reflective surface. As he approached, he saw his own reflection, but it wasn't exactly him. There were minor differences, subtle details, expressions he wasn't making, as if that image were one step ahead. "Last step," said a voice behind him. Ethan wasn't scared. He turned slowly. Eleanor was there, alone. "You've come further than the others," she continued, "because I stopped fighting against what I didn't understand," he replied. She nodded slightly. "And now," Ethan looked at the door again, "now I see what's still missing." Eleanor took a few steps closer. "That door doesn't lead anywhere," she said. "It leads to a decision. It's always been like this, hasn't it?" Yes. The silence between them was no longer hostile. It was almost respectful. "What happens when I cross?" Ethan asked. Eleanor replied bluntly, "The house will test what you believe you understand. What if I'm wrong?" She didn't look away. "Then you become part of it, just like everyone else." Ethan absorbed it without any visible reaction. "What if I'm right?" A brief silence. "So you change the rule." That was enough. Ethan turned completely towards the door. The reflection was still there, observing, waiting, but now he could see more clearly. That wasn't a version of him trying to replace him. It was a projection of what he could become if he gave in. He extended his hand. The surface of the door reacted. It rippled gently, like water. Before crossing, Ethan said, "The house doesn't just want to maintain, she wants to continue." Eleanor did not respond, but his gaze confirmed it. Ethan took a deep breath, and he crossed. The instant it passed, everything around it disappeared. There was no more hallway, there was no house left, just an empty space, white, silent, and then footsteps. A new figure began to form before him, more solid, more defined than all the others he had seen. It's different. It wasn't a distorted version, not a shadow. It was something closer to origin. Ethan realized at that moment that he had arrived at the true heart of it all, not from home, but more than what sustained her. And the final confrontation would not be against something external. It would be against the only thing that could still make him fail, himself. The white void was endless, but it didn't seem infinite either. It was a contained, precise space, as if it had been created just for that moment. Ethan remained motionless for a few seconds, watching the figure in front of him fully form. There was no distortion, no shadows, nor that artificial smile he had seen before. It was him, but not as a reflex. It was complete, every detail, every expression, every synchronized breath, as if they were two perfectly aligned versions of the same existence. "Finally," said the figure, in the same voice, without echo, without faltering. Ethan did not respond immediately. He already understood, or at least almost everything. "You're not a part," Ethan said, stepping forward. "Not even a projection." The figure tilted its head slightly. "No. So, what are you?" A brief silence. "What you avoid being." That didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like the truth. Ethan absorbed the response without flinching. "The house doesn't create," he murmured, connecting everything, "but something inside organizes. It's pointing." The figure corrected. "Choose." The figure nodded. "Maintain the balance." The surrounding space began to vibrate slightly, but not aggressively. It was like a system entering its final state. "So, all of this," Ethan continued, "isn't about imprisoning people. It's about continuity," the other replied. "The house is just the structure, and you?" "I am the filter." The silence that followed was dense. Ethan felt the weight of it. Everything made sense now. People weren't simply absorbed into the experience. They were being analyzed, divided. Parts of them remained. Others were discarded. "You separate what's useful from what's not," said Ethan. "I preserve what sustains the system and eliminate the rest. I integrate in another way." Ethan took another step forward, without fear, without hesitation. "And now?" The figure stared directly at him. Now you decide what stays. The ground beneath them ceased to exist, but neither of them fell. They were suspended, fixed. That's where everyone fails, the figure continued, because they confuse acceptance with getting lost. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He took a deep breath. When it was opened again, something was different. It wasn't courage. That was the definition. I'm not going to split myself, he said. The figure did not react. I'm not going to let you choose what stays and what goes, Ethan continued, because that is still losing control. The space vibrated more strongly. For the first time, something there reacted intensely. Control is necessary, the figure said. No, Ethan replied. Conscience is. Silence. You're trying to break the system, the other said. No. Ethan took the final step, standing face to face with him. I refuse to play it the way it was created. The figure stared at him for a few seconds, and then, for the first time, there was hesitation. Small, but it's real. If you don't separate them, the figure began, everything collapses. Ethan replied immediately, then let it collapse. The impact was not physical, but it was absolute. The white space shattered instantly like glass breaking from the inside. Lines appeared in every direction, cracking the perfect structure that had kept that place stable. The figure in front of him tried to react. You don't understand, but Ethan interrupted. I understand better than anyone who has been here. The cracks have widened, light streamed through the cracks, and behind it all, something different, not empty, but freedom. The figure moved forward, for the first time trying to stop it. If this breaks, you're not getting out, he said, now completely out of control. Ethan did not back down. I've never been trying to leave. He extended his hand. Not to push them away, but to play. And he held the other one. The moment of contact, everything stopped. Absolute silence. The cracks froze in midair. The figure looked at him, confused. You're not resisting, she said. Not even if I accept it. Ethan squeezed his hand lightly. I'm integrating. The effect was immediate. The figure began to dissolve, not like before, not being absorbed, but being unified, coming back. The cracks disappeared. The white space collapsed gently. And then darkness, for a second, too. And then the mansion. Ethan was back in the main hall, alone. The silence was different now, not heavy, not oppressive, just silence. He looked around. The walls were normal, the objects immovable. Nothing was breathing. He noticed nothing, or perhaps everything was still there, but without control over it. Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs, observing, but this time without that domineering look. You did something that no one else has done, she said. Ethan did not respond immediately. She simply looked at her own hands, firms, gifts, whole. No, she finally said. I just stopped splitting myself apart. Eleanor descended slowly, stopping a few meters from him. The house still exists, she said, but not in the same way. Me neither. The silence between them was no longer tension, it was a consequence. And for the first time since it all began, there was no more confrontation. Because the central conflict, it had been resolved. Inside it, the mansion remained silent, but now it was a common silence. The feeling of something hidden watching every movement was gone, as was the invisible pressure that once seemed to control every space. It was still an imposing place, steeped in history, but it no longer commanded Ethan's attention. He walked slowly through the main hall, observing the details that had previously seemed menacing. The paintings were still, the furniture simply occupied its places, and the air no longer carried that strange weight. It was as if something had been removed, not the house itself, but what had sustained it in the way it was. As he climbed the first steps of the staircase, Ethan noticed that many of the doors were now open. There were no more barriers, nor sudden changes in space. Each room was simply a room. The room with the photographs was still there. He went in. Images remained on the walls, but they had changed. The faces were no longer blank. The expressions were now natural, as if each person had been returned to themselves, even if only in that record. Ethan approached one of them. The missing journalist. The same thing he had recognized before. This time there was no shadow behind him, no presence, just an image of someone who existed. So that was it, Ethan murmured. It wasn't about keeping people locked up. It was about fragments. Now, without that force organizing everything, the fragments no longer had a function. He left the room and walked down the hallway. Each step confirmed the same thing. The house still existed, but it had lost control over what it absorbed. At the end of the corridor, he found Arthur. Stopped, but different. His gaze was no longer empty, not strange at all. He was human, confusing perhaps, but present. "You," Ethan began. Arthur blinked a few times like someone waking from a long sleep. He replied, his voice faltering slightly, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Ethan didn't get too close. He just watched. "Do you remember?" Arthur put his hand to his head, trying to organize his thoughts, which seemed disconnected. "Fragments," he said. "Loose things, but I am here." Ethan nodded slightly. Yes. There was no need to explain further. Arthur no longer seemed to be part of something bigger. It was just himself. And that was enough. Ethan went back downstairs to the main floor. When he reached the hall, he found Eleanor standing near the entrance. Her posture was still elegant, but there was something different about her presence. Less control, more uncertainty. "This has never happened before," she said, "because nobody made it to the end without trying to win or escape," Ethan replied. She watched him intently. "And you?" He thought for a moment. "I just understood that it wasn't a fight." The silence between them was calm. No tension, no threat, just two people facing something that had changed completely. "The house will still attract others," Eleanor said. "It always does." "Perhaps," Ethan replied, "but not in the same way." She nodded slowly, as someone who knew this was true, but still didn't fully understand the consequences. Ethan walked to the door. This time there was no resistance. No force was trying to stop him. He held the doorknob, and he paused for a second, not out of fear, but out of conscience. Upon opening the door, the light from outside streamed in naturally. The garden was there as before, but now it seemed just a garden. The trees, the flowers, everything remained in its usual state, without that artificial perfection. He took a step outside, and then another. When he turned to look at the mansion, he noticed something subtle. She was still imposing. It still carried a story. But she no longer seemed alive. Or perhaps, if only life were different, less dominant, less dependent, more empty. Eleanor remained at the entrance, watching. "Are you going to tell me what happened?" she asked. Ethan thought for a few seconds. "Not as you imagine." She waited. "Some things can't be explained without being distorted," he continued, "and others don't need to be." Eleanor didn't insist. She simply watched as he walked away. Each step he took led him back to the world he knew, but not as the same person. Upon reaching the car, Ethan stopped once more. He looked back. The mansion was still there, silent, property, but now he has no control over him. He got into the car, he started the engine, and he left. No rush, without looking again, but taking with him something that could not be written in any news report, something that couldn't be put into simple words, the understanding that not all places imprison people because of what they do. Some people are imprisoned by what they awaken, and that's sometimes the only way out. It's not about escaping, it's about ceasing to be divided. Weeks have passed since Ethan left the mansion. The world continued exactly as it always had. The streets remained crowded, people hurried, news piled up each day, everything functioning within the predictable normality that before he had never questioned. But now he saw things differently. It wasn't something visible to others. Nothing had changed externally. Ethan still worked, still talked, still followed his routine, but there was another layer to everything, a silent perception, as if he could sense when something wasn't whole. His office was as usual, organized papers, the computer screen illuminating the room, a forgotten cup of coffee to the side. On the screen, an open document had been waiting for days. The title was flashing, incomplete, Report, Structure and Anomalous Events in an Isolated Property. He had already tried to write that several times, but it always stopped at the same spot. How do you explain something that doesn't function according to the normal rules of reality? How do you describe a place that didn't imprison bodies, but decisions? Ethan took a deep breath and began to type. There is no conclusive physical evidence to support the anomalous nature of the site. He stopped. He deleted the sentence. That wasn't true, but it wasn't a lie either. It was insufficient. He rose from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, the city was bustling with life, a stark contrast to the absolute silence he had felt inside the mansion. And yet, a part of that silence remained with him. I don't see it as something negative, but as a point of equilibrium. He went back to the table and, instead of continuing the formal report, opened a new document, untitled. Without structure. He has only just begun to write, not as a journalist, but as someone who needed to record something before time made it too distant. The words flowed differently this time, without trying to prove it, without trying to convince, just describe. Some places don't visibly change you. They only reveal what was already divided. Ethan paused for a moment. He looked at the sentence, and for the first time he felt no need to correct it. It was enough. Days later, he received a call. Unknown number, he answered. Ethan, the voice was familiar. Arthur? There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a relieved breath. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to find you. Ethan leaned on the table, alert. How are you? Better than I expected, Arthur replied, still confused, but whole. The word hung in the air for a moment. Whole. Ethan smiled slightly. That's more than enough. Arthur hesitated before continuing. Do you think it's over? Ethan looked out the window again. The city remained unchanged, but he knew that question didn't have a simple answer. It's not over, he said calmly. It's just changed. Like this? Ethan took a few seconds before replying. Places like that don't exist by chance. They reflect something bigger, something that doesn't depend on a single structure. Arthur remained silent, absorbing. But they don't have the same control anymore, Ethan added, and that changes everything. On the other end of the line, there was a sigh. So everything's all right. Ethan thought for a moment. It's more true. The call ended shortly after. No long goodbyes, no need. Ethan returned to the computer and looked at the two open documents, the official report and the personal text. He knew which one would be delivered and which one would remain stored away. As the days passed, the history of the mansion never came to light. No news reports, no scandals, no public investigations. Officially, that place remained just an isolated property with a poorly documented past, and perhaps it was better that way. Some truths don't need to be amplified, because, out of the right context, they cease to be understood. On a quiet afternoon, Ethan decided to do something he hadn't planned. He drove aimlessly for some time, no rush, without a clear objective, until he realized where he was, the road, the same road that led to the mansion. He stopped the car, but it didn't go down. He stood there for a few minutes, observing from a distance. The property was still there, property, silent, like always, but that calling was gone. No sensation of being pulled inside, just distance. Ethan nodded slightly to himself. He started the car again, and this time he continued driving without looking back. Some stories end with clear answers, others end in silence. But there are those that leave something different, not an immediate fear, not a definitive explanation. But one question remains, and perhaps that is the most unsettling of all, because in the end, the mansion was never just an isolated place, forgotten by time. She was a reflection, a space where what was hidden within each person was no longer ignored. And the truth is that not everyone who enters places like this is truly prepared for what they might find, not because there's something out there waiting, but because there is something inside that has never been confronted. Ethan left. But not because it was stronger, not because it overcame something greater. He left because he did something unusual. He chose not to run away, and also not to fight. He chose to face himself completely, and that changes everything. Now I want to ask you a question, and it's important that you answer honestly. If you were in his place, would you have the courage to continue, or would he have chosen to leave before discovering the truth? Because sometimes the real mystery isn't in the house. It's in the decision you make when you realize you can't go back. If this story has captivated you this far, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This really helps us bring you more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? And what would you do in that situation? Because the next story, it may be closer than you think.